These are a few articles from uncoveringlife.com. A link to the original article is in the video description below. They are read using 11 Labs text-to-speech software. People are always asking what to do. They want to know how to play the game of life. But the only reason why all of this feels so overwhelming and difficult is that you're thinking about it like a game of chess. You believe life is a big, complex game that needs to be figured out, that everything needs to be carefully considered and all options weighed before making the next move. But life isn't supposed to be played like chess. It's meant to be played like Guitar Hero. That is, in this alive, vibrant window of effortlessly dancing sensations. You're only supposed to engage what's coming up right now. Whatever's up there on the screen is all you need to deal with. Just like tapping the notes in Guitar Hero. In Guitar Hero and in life, you're going to screw up if you think too much. Instead, you play it on feel. Then when things settle down, you can reflect upon what just happened and revise the game plan accordingly. That is, if such strategizing is itself effortlessly coming up as notes in the song. Because unless that kind of planning is arising spontaneously, there's no need to do or revise anything. You're already doing fine. You're out there fully engaged and fully immersed, hitting the notes in the song of life, letting the rhythm and flow of the song engulf you to the point where you become one with it. And then when you're really into it, when you're truly going with the flow, you might start to notice that the very act of playing is itself nothing else than simple notes coming up on the screen. And you realize that the notes are just playing themselves. The song plays itself. That's when you have become a Zen hero. Words point to flow. I've recently got some emails and blog comments with concerns about the language I use, how I talk so much about a me, and how I seemingly imply a person who's doing, wanting, resisting, and so on. But my writing could only suggest that if seen from a perspective of the universe model, therein there's people, that is, space-time entities with perceptual capabilities and cognitive faculties that can move around and do things, want things and resist things. And coming from that frame of reference, any mention of doing, wanting, or resisting naturally leads one to think of that space-time entity that's central to the universe model. But my work is all about deconstructing that model. And once that process has run its course and the model is abandoned, language is naturally seen to no longer accurately or inaccurately depict an objective reality, but to be a mere poetic attempt at describing the flow of phenomenality. In other words, any reference to a person is like a reference to Gandalf. Everybody understands that Gandalf doesn't really exist, yet we can talk about him. We can tell the story of how he helped the hobbits and fought the orcs. And everybody understands that we aren't really talking about something that actually happened outside the screen. We're simply describing how a particular storyline unfolds within the flow, not making any reference to an objectively existing space-time reality. If I say, I took a walk and had some ice cream, I don't mean to imply that there is a space-time entity with perceptual capabilities and cognitive faculties doing all that. I'm merely describing a flux of sensations, framing it within a particular model, in this case the universe model, around which dualistic language is built, and to which 99.9% of everybody subscribes. So when I say, sit down and do this, I don't mean to tell you in a literal sense that there's an actual space-time object called you that has the cognitive abilities and capacity to perform actions. I'm merely trying to invoke a torrent of sensations, which framed under the universe model would constitute you sitting down and doing something, but seen from a liberated paradigm would be recognized to be just that: subjectivity unfolding. Only if we believe that words could accurately or inaccurately depict reality would we ever concern ourselves with speaking correct, non-dual lingo. Otherwise, we're free to use language in any way we want, because we know that we aren't trying to capture reality in concepts. We're merely trying to invoke an intuitive sense of what the words could point to in direct experience. And please disregard the implicit reference to causality. That's merely a make-believe model as well. The world is made out of perceiving. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Well, there is neither sound nor tree, no forest nor fall. The world is made out of sensing. The colors of the world, the touching of the world, the hearing, smelling, and tasting of the world is all there is to the existence of the world. There are no atoms, no cells, no muscle tissue, blood vessels, or biological compounds. There are no metals, no materials, no chemicals whatsoever. And there is certainly no space, nor time in which they could exist. No, the world is made out of colors and sounds, of sensations of touch, and of smelling and tasting. Throw in thinking, and we've got the illusion going. Objects are created in the mind. Most objects are encountered visually. We only touch a fraction of the objects of our daily experience, much less smell or taste them. And when perceiving objects, we tend to believe that there is some more to our experience of them other than their colors. For example, we think that we experience a car and the colors of the car. We think that there is some objecthood to the car that is somehow being conveyed to us. But we never experience the actual car, just the particular patterns of color that we then come to think of as the car. We conceptualize and thus create the car in our minds, ascribing objecthood to those particular patterns of color. And color is really nothing but seeing, which has no independent existence from consciousness, since seeing is what consciousness is. Objects are made out of consciousness. We usually think objects are made of materials such as metal or plastic or wood. But that assumption rests on the false belief that there is an external world beyond perceptions in which such materials and the subatomic particles that comprises them could exist. What objects and their materials are really made out of are colors, body sensations, such as the feel of an object, sounds, smell, and taste, which are nothing but seeing, feeling, hearing, smelling, and tasting. There is nothing to an apple other than the colors that make up our experience of it. The seeing of the apple is the apple. And seeing, along with hearing, feeling, tasting, and smelling, are just aspects of perceiving, which is just another word for consciousness. So, the objects of our experience are made out of consciousness. In fact, there are no objects at all until we create them in our minds. Before we conceptualize a particular perception, there isn't an actual apple there, there is just a field of seeing. This field of seeing is then objectified by thinking into solid objects with an imagined reality to them, making us believe that we are experiencing a world of many objects, not realizing that all that we are ever experiencing is experiencing itself. pure objectless consciousness. Exposing the error of objectivity. Saying it simply, there is no way to assert the independent existence of space, or of anything at all, without imagining it in ways of how it appears to us. And since how it appears must be determined by the nature of our apparatus for experiencing, any claim of existence independent of such apparatus involves a contradiction. From this follows that objectivity as such is a fallacy of the human mind. There can be no external world. And this is all there is. The shackles of physicality. It's not that we awaken within a three-dimensional physical universe as an enlightened being, as a space-time entity who has had some shift in her perceptual capabilities. It's rather that the universe, including one's body, is finally recognized to be not a universe at all, but a mixture of sense percepts and conceptualizations, the non-dual nature of which suddenly become readily apparent in that moment of awakening, and makes it abundantly clear that there isn't anything physical going on. Physicality is thereby revealed as the mental fabrication it always was. And at last, we're liberated from an imagined bondage. Imagined. Because the whole problem is that we see everything through this fallacious model wherein we exist as objects in space-time, and therefore subjects to a variety of laws we have invented, the most prominent of which is the law of causation. And let's not forget the law of you must inevitably die someday. Upon awakening, then, we're liberated from these constraints. No longer are we confined by such artificial bounds, because we now recognize that both the constraints and whoever is constrained is merely a product of that false physical model of reality, a model now and forever put on the shelf along tooth fairies, unicorns, and Santa Claus. Let me put this in another way. Every apparent thing, including the so-called physical universe, is reducible to our knowing of it. Strip away all the falseness, all the erroneous conceptual structures surrounding our experience of reality, and we're left with just perception. And perception is nothing but pure knowing. And there's nothing physical about knowing. Knowing does not have width or height. It doesn't have breadth or depth. There is no start or end to knowing. What you're looking at right now is knowing made manifest. And if you ask yourself how wide this manifestation is, that is, if you ask yourself whether it's physical, you'll see that it can't be done. I mean, how wide is your field of vision? How wide is your field of feeling? In order to measure its width, we would have to start on one end of the field of experiencing and measure against the other. But there are no ends to this moment. There are no borders to experiencing. We can't locate the left border and measure the distance to the right. There are no borders. There's nothing physical about knowing. There's nothing physical going on. And besides, in order to measure its width, we would have to do so within a frame of reference, namely another space, a larger meta-reality in which the manifestation takes place. But there is no such frame of reference. This moment doesn't take place in space. Where does it take place then? Nowhere but here. The unreality of the body. The body is just another object. As other objects, the body is made out of our experiencing of it. There is nothing else to the body other than the colors that make up our seeing of it, the body sensations that make up our feeling of it, and the hearing, smelling and tasting of it, the cells, blood vessels and muscles we think constitutes. Our body are themselves nothing but colors and sensations. Look at your hand, for example. This particular pattern of color, which is nothing but seeing, is thought of, conceptualized, as a hand. But there is a massive conceptual structure of delusion that is attached to our notion of a hand. And its foundation is the belief in the external world. We believe that the hand exists whether it is experienced or not, but what a hand is the seeing of it. Turn the attention away from it and your hand ceases to exist. Our entire body is like that, entirely created in thought. It comes into existence the moment we think of it as such. Prior to that, there is just a field of pure experiencing. The conceptual structure that make up our notion of the body is very heavy. It contains so much false beliefs and presuppositions that to untangle this structure and see the falseness of it is a massive undertaking. But it can be done. Emotions, they're not where you think they are. After we've deconstructed the notion of an objective reality, it's now time to wade through the debris and pick apart whatever conceptual structures still remain that allow us to misperceive reality. One such notion is that of containment. We think that emotions exist within the body, but they don't. Feelings aren't in the gut. Look to your direct experience. Do you experience feelings as existing within the body? Isn't the body itself a sensation? Are there not merely some free-floating sensations present, some of which you call the body, but which themselves don't contain other sensations? Do you ever experience one sensation as containing another? Sensations don't exist within each other. A feeling sensation doesn't arise within another feeling sensation. A visual sensation doesn't arise within another visual sensation, or within a sound or a touch sensation. Our idea of a body, however, is fundamentally dependent on this type of grouping of sensations. As a single momentary sensation is not at all what we picture when we think of our body. Instead, our minds conjure up a multitude of sensations, visual, auditory, tactile, and emotional, that together seem to form the physical object we call body, which would be the object that contains all of these sensations. But all of that is only going on in thought. In reality, there is no actual container of sensations. The only real life referent we could have of a container would itself be a sensation. And sensations cannot exist within each other. Sensations are nothing but their experiencing, and experiencing cannot exist in experiencing. When we at last realize that this model of the body as a container of sensations isn't representative of anything in our direct experience, we can finally drop the notion that containment is a viable model of what's actually going on. Thinking in terms of containment isn't based on our direct experience. It's based on the universe model of reality wherein objects are physically contained by other objects. We believe that thoughts are literally in our heads and that emotions are actually in the body. And these beliefs make it seem as if that's true in our direct experience. But having rid ourselves of these beliefs in the objective sense, we must now investigate to see if they match up to what's given by our direct experience. So look for yourself right now. Are thoughts in your head? Do the thoughts arise within the sensation that we call head? and our emotions experienced as being in the body? Isn't the body itself merely a sensation? Thoughts only seem to come from our heads because we believe that they do. But if you envision thoughts as coming from, let's say, the belly instead, try to put your attention on your belly and think thoughts, you'll see that pretty soon it starts to feel as if they do, which demonstrates that containment is imagined rather than factual. Thoughts seem to arise from wherever we believe they do. Drop the assumption that they're located to begin with, and thoughts simply cease to arise from somewhere in particular and instead arise without being located anywhere at all. We also feel that the tactile feeling of, for example, our hand is within the corresponding visual sensation of that hand. That is, I look at my hand, and it seems as if the feeling of it resides within the visual boundaries that make up the outline of my hand. But when I investigate closely, I find that this isn't the case at all. The feeling of the hand is merely a free-floating sensation that isn't located within the visual field whatsoever. It is just a thought that suggests it does. It's easy to believe, when we look down and see our belly, that emotions exist in there. But in where? That belly is nothing but a visual sensation, and emotions doesn't exist within visual sensations. Emotions exist on their own, uncontained by any other sensation, whether visual, tactile, or otherwise. By seeing that nothing is contained in direct experience, we gradually lose the ability to believe that we're actually experiencing objects, such as one's body, which is a giant step towards liberating the knowing of I am from being object-bound, to instead allow for the sense of being to expand and encompass the entire field of experiencing, equally and neutrally, as the sensations of reality, in the absence of containers, are clearly revealed as a unified whole. But moving even beyond that, we must realize that ultimately there are no sensations at all. Sensations are nothing but their experiencing. They aren't something that is known. But what sensations ultimately are is nothing but their momentary subjective knowing. And knowing is not some thing, some positive entity that is situated within a larger reality. No, knowing is all there is to reality as such, and it is no thing at all. It's a pure negative, the very absence of objectivity, and is none other than our own being. Not a being, but being. Non-objective. It cannot be known. Non-positive. It cannot exist. It can only be. No enlightenment for the seeker. The one who is trying to find out who he is a mere puppet. To him, he is a person, empowered by volition and in control of his destiny. In truth, he is an appearance in consciousness, and phenomena can have no freedom. He thinks he's living his life not knowing that every choice and every act, he himself and all else, is governed by the hands of the totality. In other words, he's ignorant to the fact that as such he's being lived. He believes that he can be enlightened, but he can't, for he is nothing but a cluster of sensations. Visual, tactile, and auditory phenomena are construed into a body by an act of conceptualizing, which is the functioning whereby objects are fabricated in the mind, where there is nothing but fleeting sensations. He is conjured up by thought. Colors, sensations, and thoughts, which is all that he is, cannot be enlightened. Only a person could, and there is none. Free will. How would it actually work? The notion of free will simply doesn't make sense. Having realized the fictitious nature of objective reality, the question is a non-starter. There's simply no entity to possess it. But even if, for the sake of discussion, we grant the existence of a material universe, there's still no way in which free will could ever be an intelligible notion. That is, if we ask ourselves what we actually mean by the word free, we can't seem to come up with an answer. Commonly, the notion of free will means something like to be able to have chosen otherwise. In other words, I did this, but I could have done that instead. But what does it mean that I could have done differently? Let's say that I chose vanilla ice cream, but I firmly believe that I could have chosen chocolate instead. I believe that the choice to take the vanilla flavor came from myself, that the choice was mine. Sure, I may have been influenced by external forces, but I alone ultimately decided whether I wanted vanilla or chocolate ice cream today. Right? But if the choice to take the vanilla was caused by me, what then caused me to cause that choice? There has to have been a prior cause, some force making me decide what to eat, whether internal or external. Otherwise, that choice to take the vanilla ice cream is simply indistinguishable from a random one. In other words, unless I decide to decide, or something decides for me, the choice is simply random. So, do I decide to decide? Of course not. Then we would have to admit another decision, one that decided that we were going to decide, and so on ad infinitum. The only possibilities left are either that choices are random or they're caused, their causes themselves being caused, and so on, all the way back, so to speak. But neither of these alternatives fit what we mean by the word free. So what do we mean? Well, there's the problem. When we truly try to comprehend the concept of free will, we realize that we don't even know what we mean. The notion is literally inconceivable. Either choices depend on something, in which case they're not free, or they don't, in which case they're indistinguishable from random ones. There's no third alternative here. Even if we grant the existence of some kind of soul that exists outside of the chain of causation, yet with the ability to inject decisions into it, we would still be unable to come up with an idea of how free will would actually work. If we, as the source of a decision, exist outside of the chain of causation, how's that decision any different from a merely random one? And do we really mean to say that our souls are uncaused? We usually think that some force put us here. But if anything, whatever is responsible for putting us here would then also be the ultimate cause for any decisions that we come up with. Does all of this mean that there's no possibility of choice? That there aren't a multitude of possible outcomes? That everything is on rails, so to speak? Yes, it does. The idea that anything could be different than it is simply delusion. The idea that there were multiple possible outcomes to an event is nothing but a way of thinking. We call events random when we couldn't predict what was going to happen, mentally creating a plethora of possible outcomes. But all of that is just in thought. It's just a way of thinking. None of that exists in reality. The way things are is simply the only way they could be. When you realize this, that nothing could be different than it is, the habit of incessantly worrying about past and future decisions can finally come to an end. Thoughts surrounding the notions of selection and choice need not to occupy our consciousness anymore. Instead, their absence signifies a newfound freedom. Anything but constant perfection is starting to become unthinkable. In the absence of these thoughts surrounding the notion of free will, we can at last rest assured that everything is always unfolding exactly as it should. Backwards causality. It's quite fruitless, that thing we do, trying to control what's happening in the present in order to make the future into what it ought to be, when it's the future that's causing the present and not the other way around. Isn't it obvious, or at least plausible, that what's happening now is merely the prelude and lead up of what's about to become? That it merely serves to be in accordance with whatever eventuality is about to occur. Of course, these ideas of causality, whether of the backwards or the ordinary kind, are merely ways of framing experience in terms of some kind of narrative structure. But as I get to pick and choose between them, this backwards way is how I like to think about it. The way I figure, we've been conditioned to think about cause and effect the wrong way around. An anemic and depressing metaphysic wherein the action determines the outcome comes imposed through culture and language. But there's no reason why we can't unwind that philosophy and instead take on this more fascinating outlook on the whole thing. Because that's what I feel, that thinking in terms of a backwards causality is much more fun than the other way around. Under this view, things are allowed to happen for a reason. What lies ahead isn't the result of what's happening now, but what's occurring in the present is the necessary alignment with what's about to come into form. There's something happening in the future with which the present must be in accord, that requires things to happen the way they do, such that what lies ahead can be what it is due to become. This also allows us to answer why questions in terms of what we can expect from the future, rather than what follows from the past. Questions about the past, why it happened, and so on, are perfectly answered in terms of what the future and the present brought into being. Why did the house burn down? It wasn't because you were playing with matches, but you were playing with matches because you were about to find a new place to live. Why did you break up with your girlfriend? It wasn't because of that fight you had. You fought because you were about to move on to something greater and more fulfilling. And why did you get sick? It wasn't a virus. That virus merely appeared to provide a narrativistic reason for the forthcoming episode of suffering and pain, which in turn established a way for a further element in the arc, and so on in an ever-revealing storyline dictated by an obvious intelligence. And you, as a distinct character inhabiting this dream state, is not the result of what happened before. Rather, the past is what the future called for, such that you could arrive as you are in the present, and here in the now, The future continues to shape your actions and your choices so as to set the stage for an ever unfolding account of how you will come to be what you're about to become. On board yet? I don't know how to otherwise sell it, except to tell you that if there ever was an easy way of seeing more magic in life, I'd say this is it. Navigating the dream state. Question. The more I read about this, the more disconnected I feel from the people around me. It's probably ego talking, but even though not that long ago I was one of them, it seems so stupid now to live life the way they do and not care about this tremendously important subject. But even besides that, I just find I can't connect with others anymore. Even worse than I was already unable to. They aren't interested in that which moves me most, which fascinates me most. I don't think it need to be our values, ideas, and opinions that connects us to other human beings. I think it's the willingness to disengage in all of that and instead let life move on its own accord that allows for the most intimate form of connection to others. But in order to do that, one must first develop some basic trust. I've already written about moving from an intentionless place, but before you transition to that, here's a quick primer on what you can start doing right now from the top of my head. There's a basic conflict in the ordinary human way of being between what one wants to do and what one thinks he ought to do. When these two are in alignment, we experience effortlessness and flow, but when they're not, we experience distress, anxiety, and fear. But we need to realize that our idea of what we should do is a terrible guide for navigating the dream state. It's motivated by fear, not trust. Instead, we can shift into another attitude, namely that when the sense of wanting to do something arises, we view that as the universe informing us of what we really should be doing. In other words, we no longer let ourselves be guided by what we think we should do, but what we want to do. Simple, right? Stop doing what you think you should be doing and start doing what you want to do. Now, sometimes it's not so easy to tell the difference between these two. Sometimes we are so confused that we believe that our ideas of what we should be doing, in fact, are what we want to do when they're really not. So how do we distinguish between our ideas of what we should be doing and our true desire? Well, anything that suggests that you should be doing something or having something in the future is definitely not your true desire right now. So if you think you should really be working towards getting a Ferrari, but right now you want to sit in your couch, then your true desire is to sit in the couch, not having a Ferrari. And if these two are in conflict, for instance, you blaming yourself for being such a lazy bum, then you need to be a little more humble and show some respect for the wishes of the totality. Because right now, it wants to spend some time in the couch. And who are you to question that, right? The key is to listen to what you want right now. Want to take a step in this direction? Want to say that particular thing? Want to think about this now? And if you don't feel anything, if you don't want anything in particular right now, then that's the universe telling you to do nothing. It doesn't matter if you're standing by yourself in the middle of the dance floor, half drooling like an idiot. If something doesn't come up, you don't move. And before you say it, if those bills are supposed to be paid, there will come a time when you want to pay them. Now, if you'd let yourself be guided like this, you'll soon see a new way of being emerging, a way of trust, not fear. And when you move like this, you always know what to do, because you just do what you want to do in this moment. And once this becomes your new way of being, you'll now move from a place that allows you to effortlessly connect with others, if the indication to do so arises. Because any notion of what you should be doing are no longer obstructing the natural flow of things. Sort of worth a try, at least, right? Life, how to live it. Now that we've realized that free will is basically an incoherent concept, it's time to align our experience and thinking with this new way of looking at the world. After all, to have realizations and to reach a new understanding about life is pointless unless these are put to practice and turned into a living reality. In other words, it's time to change the way I think and reflect upon what I do, rewriting the way we think about choosing. Where I had previously thought in terms of I willed myself to do it, or simply I did it, I must now, in the light of the no free will insight, look at an action as if I was moved to do it. For this new way of regarding or conceptualizing our actions is far more in line with what's actually going on. Of course, I wouldn't go around and say stuff like that to people. I wouldn't say, I was moved to pass you the salt, even though I consider that a far more accurate description of what's actually going on. It's just a more correct way of thinking about what's really happening. Phenomenally, nothing is different. One's direct experience of choosing is exactly the same. But the narrative has changed. No longer is the phenomenal sense of choosing coupled with the notion of I choose to do this, but is instead regarded as if one is moved to action. And eventually, this new way of thinking also starts to shift the way choosing feels. Changing the way we conceptualize the feeling of choosing actually starts to shift the sense of agency from an I entity as a doer to a feeling that one is instead moved by the hands of the totality. Now let's break this down into more detail. Intentions. The phenomenal aspect of our personal will is the intention thought. That is, all actions where it feels as if one is the doer are always preceded by an intention. Where there's first an intention and then an action, the feeling is that we're doing something. Whereas when there's no intention, thought preceding the action. When there's just a spontaneous action, we tend to consider that movement automatic or involuntary. In terms of what it feels like, an intention thought is like a mental force or mind movement that makes up the very sense of being a doer. But much of this sense comes from the fact of how we conceptualize and think of it. And since intentions aren't really intentions, that is, since we've now abandoned the belief in free will, we can no longer justifiably call intentions intentions anymore, since that word implies the presence of a free acting agent, a concept we now realize to be nonsensical. We must now call that phenomenal aspect of our will something different. something more in alignment with our understanding, something that accurately reflects what's actually going on. An inclination of the universe, an impulse of the totality. By ceasing to regard that phenomenal aspect as intention and starting to think of it as an impulse of the totality instead, we can slowly begin to escape the connotations that give rise to the sense of being a doer. However, towards a better way to live life, it's entirely possible to live and act in this world completely without intentions altogether. That phenomenal aspect that precedes every conscious action, we don't need it. This is the true meaning of the word surrender. This is what it means to release the tiller, to relax, and let the universe do the driving. We don't need intentions. We just think we do. It's just so hard to imagine otherwise. I mean, what can be more obvious than the fact that if I want to pick up my keys, I need to will myself to do it, right? But realize how ridiculously many actions you perform every day that aren't preceded by an intention. For instance, when taking a stroll, I'm not using the force of my willpower to put my left foot in front of my right. No, walking simply happens all by itself, without any need for intentions. And consider the multitude of involuntary hand and arm movements that happen all the time. We're incessantly scratching and touching ourselves all over without any preceding intentions. It's all spontaneous, involuntary action. It's effortless doing without the sense of being a doer. So try this out. The next time you're at the point of making a conscious decision, simply don't. For instance, let's say you're out walking and you're at a point where you can either choose to go left or right. Shall I go left or right? You think. But then allow yourself to answer a mere I don't know, and then wait, don't make a choice. Eventually you will simply start walking, left or right, spontaneously, without any intention, doing, or effort, even if it takes you 2 hours before anything happens, and you're just standing there like an idiot. Or sit down on a sofa and decide to not do anything by intention. When an intention arises, simply ignore it and instead wait and see how long it takes before your body does something entirely spontaneous, effortless, and completely automagical, without any involvement of intention. It probably won't take very long. It's entirely possible to always act and live in this way. To abandon intentions completely, simply live without them, always waiting to see what happens next. But getting there is a gradual transition. To go from intention-based doing to intentionless, spontaneous living takes some time. As you see in real time that everything is unfolding perfectly fine without intentions, you begin to realize that you don't have to worry about the future, because you now know, you have faith that everything will be taken care of exactly as it should, when it should, by an intentionless unfolding of the totality. By doing these experiments, one can gradually grow this faith to develop a knowing that everything is being taken care of and that I don't need to have a hand in the game for it to be running. As faith develops, more and more of these intentions can be let go, and instead allow for life to express a smooth and effortless living without any ego obstruction. Faith isn't something that you can convince yourself to have. It's something that you have to slowly acquire by seeing in real time that everything is working out all by itself. But the whole thing does require an initial leap, a simple step out of the way so that life can begin flowing smoothly and effortlessly now that you aren't always obstructing the current. People are always asking what to do. They want to know how to play the game of life. But the only reason why all of this feels so overwhelming and difficult is that you're thinking about it like a game of chess. You believe life is a big complex game that needs to be figured out, that everything needs to be carefully considered and all options weighed before making the next move. But life isn't supposed to be played like chess. It's meant to be played like Guitar Hero. That is, in this alive, vibrant window of effortlessly dancing sensations. You're only supposed to engage what's coming up right now. Whatever's up there on the screen is all you need to deal with. Just like tapping the notes in Guitar Hero. In Guitar Hero and in life, you're going to screw up if you think too much. Instead, you play it on feel. Then when things settle down, you can reflect upon what just happened and revise the game plan accordingly. That is, if such strategizing is itself effortlessly coming up as notes in the song. Because unless that kind of planning is arising spontaneously, there's no need to do or revise anything. You're already doing fine. You're out there fully engaged and fully immersed, hitting the notes in the song of life, letting the rhythm and flow of the song engulf you to the point where you become one with it. And then when you're really into it, when you're truly going with the flow, you might start to notice that the very act of playing is itself nothing else than simple notes coming up on the screen. And you realize that the notes are just playing themselves. The song plays itself. That's when you have become a Zen hero.